Out of the major wars the U.S. has fought, the War of 1812 was by far the most underrated, as it was the first major war where the U.S. Army was put to the test on its own merit against a foreign power. Although it was seen as its own separate war by the U.S., the direct cause of the conflict can trace its origins back to the Napoleonic Wars. In addition, the war would also shape the country and the peoples involved in the conflict, for better or for worse. With the US fighting the British Empire again with no major allies, what are the contributing factors that led to the war? One factor often overlooked when discussing the War of 1812 is the Louisiana Purchase. Historically, Louisiana was a French colony up until it was ceded to Spain after the 7 Years' War. Fast forward to 1800, and as Spain was threatened by the ever-growing French Empire under Napoleon, Spain signed the Treaty of San Ildefonso, which gave Louisiana back to France in exchange for Tuscany. Although a huge gain for France, it was short-lived, as there was a slave uprising in Haiti. So, rather than protecting Louisiana from an impending British invasion, Napoleon decided to quell the revolt. The reason why will be discussed in another time. But needless to say, it allows the US to buy Louisiana for $15 million. The purchase gives France the much needed money to immediately declare war on Britain. Another factor is trade. Being a neutral country, the US was a major exporter of commodities to both countries during the war, making huge profits in the process. But as the war dragged on, both sides sought to starve one another, with France's continental system and Britain's huge navy. This in turn made trade very difficult, as US ships embarking for France were seized by the British. They argued that the US violated the rule of 1756, which stated that any neutral country traded goods to an enemy country is an act of war. Although France did seize American ships, Britain is by far the most egregious, as these seizures took place off American shores. In response, the US passed the Non-Importation Act of 1806, which barred certain British goods from being imported to America. Angered, Britain then blockaded continental Europe even more, which in turn angered the French and outlawed trade to Britain outright. To make matters worse, the British Navy captured and forced around 6,000 American sailors to serve under the British flag, which was previously reserved for deserters who sought better pay. Although many Americans called for war against Britain, President Thomas Jefferson instead enacted the Embargo Act of 1807, which he hoped that banning all foreign trade will force both Britain and France to lift embargoes on American trade. This backfired and the call for war grew louder. Not only that, many Americans believed that Britain was supporting the Native Americans to interrupt American settlement into the Northwest, which was still occupied by Native Americans. With efforts for neutrality futile, in 1808, the newly elected president, James Madison, decided that the only way to solve the crisis is to go to war. He hoped that in addition to solving the crisis, he'll also gain Canada as compensation, as he sees it as a lightly defended colony that could be easily overrun. Although the Democratic Republican Party supported the declaration, Federalists saw it as a bad idea, as not only Britain could easily send in troops to America quickly due to having a large navy, it will also have to deal with the Native Americans in Canada if they ever won a war. On June 16, 1812, Britain withdrew their blockade from Europe, but due to the message taking too long to reach Washington, in addition to the majority of Congress wanting war, the United States declared war on the United Kingdom on June 8, 1812, the first time done in its history. It's important to understand the state of both armies at the start of the war. For the US, it had a small army of around 6,700, of whom had little combat experience aside from skirmishes against Native American tribes. Despite having a small army, the US had an advantage of calling out the militia for local defense, which made up the bulk of its manpower throughout the war. In comparison, the British had a huge army of 240,000, having decades of experience fighting against Napoleon, in addition to having the largest navy in the world at their disposal. But despite their advantages, it would take a while for the British to muster a significant force. Luckily, about 15,000 Native American tribes allied with the British. Chief among them was Tecumseh, who sought to unite all Native American tribes in the region from American encroachment. With war now declared, American troops led by General William Hull invaded Canada through the Detroit River in July. Despite outnumbering the British, his army were too unprepared to mount a successful attack on Fort Amherstburg, forcing his army to withdraw from Canada. Knowing their retreat, both Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh's forces chased Hull back to the US-Canadian border and into Fort Detroit, where he and his entire force surrendered without firing a single shot. Sir Isaac Brock would be killed 2 months later while successfully repelling another American invasion at Queenston. Meanwhile, the battle at sea was going well for the US, with the USS Constitution scoring a number of victories against the Royal Navy. These naval engagements boosted morale at home, and it would continue throughout the war. Meanwhile on land, the US tried to retake Fort Detroit with disastrous results. At the same time, many American prisoners of war were killed in the hands of Native Americans. In response to the horrific act, Kentucky soldiers rallied for the cause, shouting, "Remember the River Raisin!" In April 1813, American troops invaded Canada once again, but unlike the last invasion, it was a success as they managed to capture the capital city of Upper Canada and burn the capital into the ground. But despite this, it came at a high cost for the Americans, along with having very little strategic value. Americans would also capture Fort George, but the defeat at Chateauguay and Chrysler's Farm ultimately prevented the Americans from taking Montreal. However, in September 1813, the US Navy under Oliver Hazard Perry was able to score another major victory at Lake Erie. Less than a month later, the US was able to make a decisive blow on Tecumseh's force at the Thames River, resulting in the death of Tecumseh, along with the dissolution of his confederacy, in which afterwards a civil war erupted among the supposed Creek nations, as one still supported Tecumseh and the other wanted to assimilate to Western civilization. One of these Creek groups, collectively known as the Red Sticks, continued to fight against the US. To finally put an end to the Native American war effort, a little-known general and future president Andrew Jackson would destroy the Red Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, forcing the Red Creeks to sign a treaty which granted the US 23 million acres of supposed territory, including those who were allied. With the Native American threat gone, the US would again invade Canada for a third time, before withdrawing from Canada again a few weeks later. By this time, the Napoleonic Wars just ended, which allowed the British to pour more resources into the American campaign. On August 1814, an expeditionary force of 4,500 veteran soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars, led by General Robert Ross, landed at Maryland, and during his campaign, his forces was able to rout the US Army at Bladensburg, and as they advanced towards Washington, what happens next would live in infamy, as Ross's forces would capture Washington. In response to the burning of York a year before, Ross ordered his men to set fire on the Capitol, including the White House, which at the time was named the Presidential Mansion. This kind of attack on US soil by a foreign power won't occur for another century. A month later, the British Army made another landing at Baltimore, but unlike Washington, Baltimore was heavily defended by fortifications. Fighting was fierce, but due to being outnumbered, in addition to having strong defenses, the British needed to call its trusted navy to bombard the Americans. Setting their target at Fort McHenry, The British bombarded the fort for 27 hours, but despite this, the fort suffered very little damage, thanks to fortification efforts before the battle. The British tried to draw troops out of the fort, but was not successful. Meanwhile, Sir Francis Scott Key had experienced the bombardment while boarding a British ship, and on the morning of September 12, 1814, he saw an American flag raised over the fort. Amazed, he would write a poem, which would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner. With the war going nowhere, the Treaty of Ghent would be signed on Christmas Eve of that year. But it would take a while before news reached America. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson would achieve a stunning victory against the British at Orleans, giving him the much-needed fame to be eventually elected as president years later. On February 17, 1815, James Madison would ratify the treaty, ending the war. To summarize, although the British had a well-trained army, in addition to having the largest navy, winning a fair share of battles up until the very end of the war, the US military managed to hold on its own, despite the odds stacked against them, especially the Navy, as it won a string of naval battles against the British, which helped boost morale after the Army's failure to take Canada. Although the war ended at a stalemate, the war would serve as a proving ground for US military strength, in addition to kickstarting the Monroe Doctrine, which sought to stay away from European affairs in order to continue expanding westward. Britain would keep its empire, but one of its colonies, Canada, would begin to seek independence down the road. Meanwhile, Native Americans will continue to lose their ancestral homeland to the expanding US, and with no support from any major power, in addition to never forming an actual state of their own, despite centuries of contact, Native Americans will continue to be seen as small primitive tribes by the world. Had the Native Americans formed their own country, and no, Iroquois is not a legitimate state, who knows what will happen? Maybe it'll be answered in another dimension, if they even exist. That concludes this episode. Let's hope that the next episode won't take another 2 months to release.